I'm Elaine O'Keefe. I'm the Executive Director of CERA, and I thank you all for joining us today for this AIDS seminar. And I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker, Carol Galletly, who is from a sister AIDS Prevention Research Center. She is at the CARE program.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
In Milwaukee with Jeff Kelly, and we've been working collaboratively with her center and other AIDS Prevention Research Centers on numerous mutual HIV prevention research interests. She's here today to talk to you about the issue of HIV criminalization, which is very timely for multiple reasons, including the release of the new National AIDS Strategy and the emphasis on identifying more people with HIV with good goals of getting them into treatment and preventing and so on. However, there could be some unintended consequences of that, including more emphasis on criminalization of HIV transmission. So we want to vet that topic today, and I want to point out that Dr. Bob Levine is here, who is the director of our Law Policy and Ethics Corps. And we're doubly delighted to have Carol because the Law Policy and Ethics Corps is sponsoring a series of discussions on this very issue. We don't know what the product will be yet, but Carol's input has been vital to our work, and so thank you again.
My name is Carol Galletly. I'm from the Center for AIDS Intervention Research, and I am an attorney, social scientist, so I have sort of dual roles. By nature, what I do is very multidisciplinary. My law degree and my PhD work were from the Ohio State University, which has the best football team on the planet. So there you go. And I am here to talk about impact of state criminal HIV exposure laws on people living with HIV. And actually, this is on people living with HIV in Michigan. This was what we think is probably the first empirical study in the nation, perhaps in the world actually, on the impact of these laws directly on people who have HIV. So this will give you a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with what we mean by HIV exposure laws. 26 US states have adopted criminal laws that prohibit persons who have HIV from engaging in sexual activity with another without prior disclosure. So there's 26 states. Now, this doesn't mean that in the other states you can't prosecute someone for not disclosing. And in fact, you can. The other states can use regular criminal law, for instance, reckless endangerment. So just classic criminal law. These states, what they did was went a step further and created HIV-specific statutes. So what they said was, we're not going to use the general criminal law, we're going to have special statutes. This was actually prompted by Ryan White CARE Act. What they said was, one of the stipulations in order to get monies from a certain pot of monies from Ryan White was that every state certify that they either had a law that they could use, an existing law that they could use to prosecute people who, and this is interesting, people who transmitted HIV intentionally to others or attempted to do so. So what the Ryan White law said is either you need to certify that you have a law already that can address intentional exposure, or you need to have an HIV-specific law that will do that. So 26 states responded by enacting their own HIV laws. I'll give you some sense of variability in the laws. When you consider this topic and you're looking at laws, be aware, of course, as we know from the Constitution, powers are left to the states unless enumerated. True? So it ends up that this issue, most criminal law issues, are state issues. So there isn't one federal law. Each state creates its own statute or uses its law in its own way. So we end up having 26 different HIV-specific laws. We also have a variety of other approaches. Some states that don't have an HIV-specific law do have what we call a sentence enhancement. And that's what, for instance, we have in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we don't have an HIV disclosure law or exposure law. But we do have a law that says if you commit a serious sex crime and you have HIV, your sentence will be enhanced. So you'll have a longer sentence. So that's another way of addressing HIV transmission or exposure. So the things you look at when you're considering these laws is first, what's the behavior that triggers the statute? They really go, you can think of them on a continuum from the most strict to the least strict. The most strict law, practically, and in fact Michigan is one of them, so you'll be learning about it. Basically what triggers them is you even think about having sex and you've got to disclose. It's not quite that bad. But the most strict law is very easily triggered. So it could be oral sex. They could say, and actually in Michigan, it's actually mutual masturbation. At that point, an individual needs to disclose they have HIV. And you'll see the statute. On the other end of the spectrum is a statute like California. What triggers that is unprotected anal or vaginal sex. That's it. They don't include oral sex. So for instance, in California, if you have oral sex, if you have HIV and you have oral sex with someone else, you don't have to disclose, at least by that statute. And California's law is even more protective of people who have HIV. You'll see with this next one. Culpability. When you're looking at these statutes, you're going to look at what's the behavior that triggers this. You're also going to look at the actor, which would be the HIV positive actor in this situation. How culpable do they need to be? And what we mean by that is there's a legal term, it's called mens rea, or guilty mind. What intention did they act with? So on the most strict, it requires no intention at all, except to have sex with somebody, for instance. And you'll understand this better if you think of the least strict, or the least strict is no intention at all. The most strict is you act with criminal intention. You act with malice. You want to infect this other person. So at one end of the spectrum, you have criminal intent. At the other end of the spectrum, all you need to do to trigger this law is have intent to have sex with somebody. So you see how these work? They really do go from very strict to not so strict. The next one is requirements that a person who has HIV needs to do to engage lawfully in the behavior. And there's not a whole lot of variation, but some laws require somebody to disclose, so to tell their partner they have HIV. Some laws require disclosure and consent. Now, it doesn't mean that the laws that don't say consent mean, you can legally have non-consensual sex. But what it does mean is in a law that mentions both disclosure and consent, your prosecutor is going to have to prove both of those. Makes it a little more difficult to prosecute somebody. So the factors when you're thinking about these laws are behavior, culpability, requirements to engage in the behavior lawfully, and penalty. You would be amazed. I'll show you some penalties here. But the penalties range in the US from 30 days in jail to 30 years in prison. It's really, there is so much variation. Any questions about that so far? Kind of a whirlwind. This is how you look at HIV statutes. Okay, so now here's an example of penalties, just to kind of show you, they're not exactly playing around here. So look at Arkansas statute for an HIV-specific crime, or HIV-specific law, and this is heavy duty. Idaho is not more than 15 years, or a fine of no more in excess than $5,000. So these are significant crimes. And to give you a sense of this, I gave you some penalties here. There's comparative penalties. In the model penal code, which is a model code for the US, rape is minimum of 1 to 3 years, maximum of 10. Okay, so that gives you an idea. And assault with a deadly weapon, minimum of 2, maximum of 5. So we have a lot of statutes, a lot of HIV-specific statutes are certainly more severe than this. Okay. There are some significant concerns about these laws, which has led me to studying them, actually. It was because these laws in many ways seem so ludicrous that I chose this as an area of study. And here's one of the biggest reasons why these laws are very concerning. This is from Arkansas. And this is how Arkansas introduces their HIV-specific law in their code, in their criminal code. What they say is a person with acquired immune deficiency syndrome is infectious to others, okay, through the exchange of body fluids during sexual intercourse, and needles, basically, right? But look at this. And under these circumstances is a danger to the public. Now, those of you with public health backgrounds know, how do you earn the confidence of somebody who has an infectious disease? Their cooperation is essential for us stopping the spread of this epidemic. Their cooperation is absolutely essential. So how do you get somebody's cooperation? It certainly is not by telling them they're a danger to the public health. Also, how do you get people to get tested, right? To find out, do they have HIV? Because we know that people who are tested and know they have HIV take measures to prevent transmission, right? So you want people to get tested. We also have great medications now. We can prolong life. This is a big deal, right? Well, one of the ways you get people to get tested is not calling them a danger to the public. Gee, find out if you have this virus. And then if you do, you'll be a danger to the public. So what this set up, and so many of these laws set this up, is this idea of, well, you make a criminal law, you create criminals. And the minute you create criminals, you also create victims. And that's key here, because the public health message about HIV is it's preventable. You can prevent HIV infection, and it's in most cases under your control by practicing safer sex, practicing alternatives to penetrative sex, et cetera, right? So our message is this disease is preventable and you can prevent it. Well, then the law does exactly the opposite. The law says there are criminals and there are victims. We need to step in and protect the public from these dangers. So can you see where some of the tension starts coming in? Okay, then here's another one. Another concern is the scientific validity of these laws. Now, this comes from Idaho, okay? And both of these, again, are states that have significant penalties, right? In Idaho, they say any person who exposes another in any manner to HIV by the transfer or attempted transfer of a body fluid shall be punished, right? Look what they use as body fluids. Semen, blood, saliva, vaginal secretions, breast milk, and urine. Now, what do you guys know about HIV transmission? You know, I should have probably figured that out. I assume all of you have some basic HIV. Is that true? Well, if you don't, it'll begin right now. Here's your HIV education. Urine will not transmit HIV. Saliva, although we can detect HIV in saliva, it's at such minuscule levels, it's sort of like dropping a drop of poison in a swimming pool. If we have sensitive enough equipment, we may be able to detect it, but it certainly is not going to get anybody sick. So what they've done in Idaho is they have said, look, this law applies to transfer of blood, vaginal secretions. We know breast milk, right? But look, they've included urine and saliva, which won't transmit HIV. So they're actually prohibiting or requiring disclosure prior to behaviors that don't transmit HIV. What they're doing by this, too, is also miseducating the public, right? Because we in public health can jump up and down and say, saliva will not transmit HIV. Saliva will not. You know, you're not going to get HIV because someone who has HIV sneezes on you. But who's the public going to really think about or really remember? What the public health people are saying or what the criminal law is saying? Which one has more authority? Probably it's going to be the criminal law. So here they go and say things that are, that are contrary to what we know about HIV. Okay, so those are some of the concerns. Now, this is the other thing, and then we'll get into my study. But one of the things you need to think about, at least I have been thinking about a whole lot with this topic, is what's the difference between the way the people in the law think about these things and the way we in public health think about these things? Because obviously something's going on. We're not on the same page with this. Now, what you need to remember, there are mistakes in the law. Clearly, urine and saliva will not transmit HIV. But some of the other things are not so much mistakes as, I believe, perspective. Look in the law. Black's Law Dictionary is sort of the Webster's for lawyers. It's the definitive source. If you've got to define something, you go to Black's Law. Look at what Black's Law defines as exposure. So it's in a position where the object, that's in the law, that's the person. Not that we objectify people, but the object spoken of is open to danger, or, now watch this, where it is near or accessible to anything which may affect it detrimentally. Okay, now you think about this. Using this definition, the only thing, think of safer sex, right? Sex with a condom. So here's this latex layer. In public health, we see that latex layer as preventing infections. We see that as a lifesaver, right? We understand this latex layer very differently. Lawmakers are thinking, heck, if the only thing between me and something awful is this, microfine latex layer, this person is definitely being exposed to danger. So the law, many things that we see as not dangerous, the law is thinking very, very differently. And that's one of the big issues about that. Near or accessible. Okay. Is that, any questions? Mm-hmm.
So how difficult is it to remove those two words from Idaho's law, to remove the word?
So the question is, how difficult would it be to remove the words from Idaho's law? And the answer is, got 50 years and a whole lot of money. It's very difficult once law is enacted to actually have it changed, especially when it's enacted poorly in a variety of states. The first state, of course, is always going to be the most difficult. Then you apply pressure from the other states. But it would actually be very, very difficult. There are absolutely nuts laws, though, on the books, laws that make no sense on the books. The issue is that they're not enforced. So one of the ways that you take away the power of a law is by not enforcing it. So an example is, I think it's Iowa. They have a law on the books that if a person is cross-dressing, so if they're dressing according to a sex that they are not genetically, they have to have one item of clothing that's consistent with their genetic sex, or somehow they're violating the law. Yeah, I mean, there's just nuts laws on the books. So one of the ways is you don't enforce it. The challenge is, in the United States, we have more prosecutions under these laws than anywhere else in the world. So,
Carol, quickly, when was that law passed? Did you say that earlier?
I didn't, yeah, I mean, it should be, I should have put it in the citation. Let's hope I've done my homework here. I believe it's 89.
Yeah.
It was 89. Oh, no, this is the danger to the public. Shoot. Okay, well, you could be my legal writing teacher because you just pointed out that I did not cite it. I think it's early. It's got to be. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So.
Now, are the Arkansas and Idaho laws enforced?
They are indeed enforced. And actually, both of them have had prosecutions in the last 2 years. Yeah. In the back?
You may get to this at the end, but do you think it's better as a strategy to repeal some of these laws that are outdated, and then, if need be, write them in a more sensible way, or try to modify them?
The question is, would it be better to repeal these or amend them, modify them? And the answer is, I think, people haven't been asking that question, believe it or not. Because there's, again, this big schism between public health and the law, scientists who are looking at these, and lawmakers. There's a group now that has come together, and they have a goal. They're going to try to change this law. My bet is they haven't decided what they're going to do, but the best strategy, I think, would be try to get federal legislation prohibiting these laws. Once you do that, then you've got the whole 50 states covered.
So going back to Black's law, if a steroid-discordant couple has sex, the condom breaks, and the relationship doesn't work out, then
It's worse than that.
Yeah.
The condom doesn't have to break.
doesn't even have to break.
No. So, but then somebody's got to be willing to perjure themselves, probably. The way it works is, if you disclose, people who have HIV feel very vulnerable with these laws. If you disclose, then have any sort of sex, right? Let's say you disclose and your partner agrees to unprotected sex. Let's say that they're the insertive partner, maybe it's oral sex, et cetera, et cetera. So your partner perceives that they're not too much at risk, so you enjoy whatever you enjoy, right? Then if something happens later, the partner can say, he didn't disclose, she didn't disclose. People who have HIV are not very sympathetic defendants, right? I mean, who are you going to listen to? The person that says, they didn't disclose and I'm a victim and they're a threat to me? Or the person who says, I have HIV, I disclosed, you need to believe me? So it makes people feel very, very vulnerable. Okay, maybe I shouldn't open, okay, well, that's okay, we got lots of time. Well,
in terms of penalties, I thought that if the victim ultimately dies of HIV-related complications, that it can be prosecuted as homicide.
okay, so the question is, or the statement is, that if the victim ultimately dies, so HIV is transmitted and the victim dies, it can be prosecuted as homicide. That was years ago in states where they used the classic criminal law. What happened was they would call it they would call it murder. The problem with prosecuting that is, this is again years ago, is that the defendant would often die before the victim, because this was before we had lots of medications available. So you can certainly try, but you've got to keep your defendant alive. And typically, your defendant is going to have HIV at least 1 day longer than your victim. So what they did for a while, and still do in some states, is attempted murder. That way you don't have to kill them. You just have to show intention to harm them. And that's a different ballgame. Actually, that's very rare that we're finding cases where somebody who has HIV has an intention to hurt somebody else. Proving that in court, too, is very, very difficult. So there were times when it was murder. Oh, but actually, I'm sorry, recently, there was a saliva case and attempted homicide. What they ended up saying in that case, and I think it was Iowa. No, Iowa was a bite. There was somewhere where what they ended up saying was, this individual had HIV, kind of one fry short of a Happy Meal, had some issues going on, didn't understand how HIV was transmitted, believed he could transmit HIV through saliva, was arrested, angry, spit on an officer. So they tried to do attempted murder because it's from his perspective. This is way more legal education than you ever wanted, but attempt is often from the perspective of the actor, not the victim. So if I believe that I can do something, even though it's absolutely impossible, I can still be charged in most states under an intent. Okay, enough. But it's a fascinating, I mean, this is just an amazing topic. Of course, it's mine. So here's our, yeah.
I'm sorry, it's just
That's okay.
I just wanted to clarify, the inclusion of saliva in urine, was that an error or was it intentional? I mean, the people who wrote that.
Oh, it's a great question. So the question is, did they include, this is see if I interpret this right, did they include saliva in urine because it accidentally got in there, right? Or were they really thinking, or did they know they were wrong? I guess I don't understand the question.
Right, like did they include it because whoever wrote it thought you could transmit it that way, even though that's incorrect? Or was there did they in fact know that you could not transmit it that way, but you're just adding things on, so once it's in the statute, you can still prosecute against them for that?
That's a great question. The answer is I have absolutely no idea. The problem is we can look back in legislative history sometimes, and you can see what issues were going around, right? And so you'll see maybe a conflict. Well, I think it's this way. I think it's this way. But a lot of these laws happened before everything became available on the web, for instance, before everything was, so you don't have consistent history with everything. My bet is, and this is just my personal belief, is back again, let's say 89, 90, when Ryan White first came out and said you need to do this, people, especially those who weren't at risk, were nervous about scientific evidence about transmission. So they would say, well, yeah, you know, I know they say you can't transmit this by urine and saliva, but you know, those people are in public health, they're liberal, don't you know? So we're going to put this in the law. That would be my bet, is they were trying to cover their bases. What you'll see, though, in the law in the state that I worked in, it looks like an actual error. So I'll show you that in a second. She had her hand up first.
But even taking, like, not considering HIV, but just looking at laws in general, when you have the perspective of victim and, you know, isn't it historically, when you're enacting a law, more likely that you are going to err on the side of being as protective as possible of the victim? And that's why things like urine and saliva, that they're going to go to the ultra-conservative, because that's the way the legal system works.
So I can't restate that, but it was a great, can you hear that?
A little.
Okay, so the comment is, well, don't most laws sort of err on the side of the victim? And so if there is some question or some issue, they'll include urine and saliva, erring on the side of the victim. The answer to that is, actually, our legal system is set up to go the other way. So in statistical terms, it's type B error, but our legal system is set up so that we are willing to lose more defendants who are actually guilty. So we're willing for them to be found not guilty than we are to find guilty someone who is not. So actually our whole legal system is based on the opposite. Now, is that what happened? I don't think so. I really don't. I think this is an amazing chunk of history there's a lot of amazing chunks of history. This happens to be one where we are actually able to see sort of fear legislated, bias legislated. I mean, and it's happened before, but it happened here too.
I just wanted to say that in the 80s, there was widespread opinion that you could spread HIV by saliva, urine, sitting on a toilet seat. One of the most powerful images I saw was a very famous television actress on network television was interviewed about this, and she said, "Oh, you see, the actors in the movies are at much more risk than we are because they kiss with their mouths open."
Yeah.
And it then froze this image
right.
for the viewing public. And who could question? It was one of the famous, beauty queen types.
Right. And if it's on the television, it has to be true.
Oh, yes.
And certainly it's sexier than public health officials.
Yeah.
They care about dental caries and, I don't know, washing your hands, and they're not very interesting. And they're hiding things as if that's in their best interest to do that. So, yeah, there was a lot of controversy. These laws, the earliest is 88. So that's after there was a definitive test. There was probably some question, and there were lots of actresses, or plumbers who thought for sure this is how HIV could be transmitted. Okay, on? No? Okay, so this is our study. First, it starts with Michigan's HIV disclosure law. The reason that I was so interested when somebody said, could it be a mistake in the law, is look at this law. Okay, a person who knows that he or she is HIV infected, that's really important. We fear legislation that doesn't require this knowledge, what we would call negligent transmission. You should have known. You're gay, you should have known, for example. Okay, that is happening in other places in the world, not in the US, and not in Michigan's law. So this is a person who knows that they're infected, engages in sexual penetration with another person without having first disclosed. Okay? Now watch how they define sexual penetration. Sexual penetration means sexual intercourse, which in the law is typically penis to vagina. Cunnilingus, fellatio, anal intercourse. Okay. Or any other intrusion, however slight, of any part of a person's body or an object into the genital or anal openings of another person. So what that means is, For example, using a sterile, let's say not sterile, using a non-contaminated sex toy to pleasure a partner would require disclosure. Digital stimulation would require disclosure. We're talking, this is so broad. Now this one, I believe, is in error. What it is this definition of sexual penetration comes actually from some statutes addressing rape. Now, there are times in rapes where an individual is either not able to complete the rape, in other words, they can't get an erection, or they don't have a penis, for example, because they're a woman, or they're really humiliating the individual. So they're doing things like penetrating with guns, penetrating with things that are around, right? So in a rape statute, you do want to include this stuff. Because, you talk about violating a human, that it wasn't, a penis, still doesn't mean there was no violation. I believe what happened was, came time to write these HIV statutes, and they just took the standard definition of sex from the code and put it into the statute. I can't prove that because, again, this legislative history, you can't find it. But what's sort of concerning is that there are 4 states in the US that adopted this exact definition. So Michigan, where I did my study, Illinois, New Jersey, and Oklahoma. So they just, it's like copying the error. So anyway, this is probably the broadest definition. Okay, so we set out to answer some research questions. Everybody was saying these laws are terrible, these laws are horrible, they're awful, they're hurting people, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody had ever looked at it empirically. So we thought, let's take a look. So we chose a state with a particularly onerous law, and we gathered HIV positive people and asked them questions about these laws. So our questions that guided the research were, are the residents even aware, are HIV positive residents even aware these laws exist? Is there a possibility that all of us are sitting here in academia saying, oh, they're terrible, they're horrible, lots of activists are, but people don't really know about the laws? They did a research project where they were asking about HIV testing law and found that nobody was aware of it. They didn't care about it anyway. So are state residents who are living with HIV aware of this law? And do they understand it? Because in order to have a negative impact or a positive one, you have to have people who are aware. Very first question.
How long had the law been on the books when you started asking people about it?
This is 2010. 20 years? 20? Something like 20. Long time. Long time. Yeah. Okay, so are they aware? And there were people who would say, oh, they're not aware. Don't even worry about it. This is not an issue. They don't even know about it. Just like they don't know they have to wear, one article of clothing. Okay. Then the next question was, and this was a tricky question. This is where researchers get into law. Is it effective? We had to be willing to find that it was effective, which was not popular and was kind of risky. And I'll give you the results in just a minute. So does the law increase disclosure? You need to remember, though, increasing disclosure does not mean necessarily you're reducing risk. There's certainly evidence out there that there are people who disclose and then choose to have unprotected sex. So we also asked, does the law decrease transmission risk? Not just does it increase in disclosure, but then among those couples, does it decrease the risk? Then we asked, does the law have these harms, these concerns? So does it serve as an inadvertent disincentive to disclosure? What that means is, if you could think about this, it's kind of ironic, but let's say you have HIV. You know that there's a criminal law out there that regulates your behavior. Typically, the best side of a criminal law is nowhere near it, right? So if you don't want to take the chance of being falsely accused, et cetera, you don't want people to know you have HIV. So then you're not vulnerable to the law. So that would be a disincentive. Another situation we often worry about is, let's say an individual doesn't disclose the first time, right? Let's say they're in a state, that includes oral sex. They don't disclose first time. What happens is this law then provides a disincentive never to disclose, because then they've broken the law. That's not from a public health standpoint what you want. Is that pretty clear? Okay, then does the law increase stigma? Remember, this is a law that says people who have HIV are basically criminals, or more likely to be criminals, right? So we look at HIV-related stigma. Are people internalizing these messages? We know HIV-related stigma is associated with lots of things we don't want, like failure to disclose, often failure to practice safer sex, failure to take your medications, et cetera, et cetera. So are these laws inadvertently increasing stigma? And are these laws giving people who have HIV the message that you are not liked, you are not cared for, and are they generalizing this, for instance, to the public health system? Okay, so these are big questions. And then we ask them their stance on criminalization. Do participants support or oppose criminalization? How do people who have HIV think about these laws? And this is what we found. Oh no, here's our participants. We had 384 participants in Michigan. All of them had HIV. They were, it was truly a state sample in that we divided the state into regions. We recruited in that region in proportion to the number of people who had HIV that were living in that region. So it was truly a statewide sample. Just over half of our participants were African American. Just over a third were female. The ages ranged. The mean was 43. But clearly, I mean, you could see with the standard deviation that we hit actually a younger population. Just over 2/3 were sexually active. This was interesting because people think, oh, if you have HIV, you're not going to be sexually active somehow. I mean, some people have difficulty conceptualizing that people who have HIV have active, healthy sex lives. So we were able to say, well, 2/3 of them were sexually active in the previous 12 months. Persons in the sample were representative persons living with HIV in terms of age, race, and actually exposure category. But we did oversample women because I was concerned we weren't going to get enough of the women's voices. So we actually did some concerted targeted sampling. So our sample is not representative. We had a few more women. Okay, so here's the answers to our questions. Were they aware of the law? 76% of our sample were aware of the law. So what we found is there are people who are saying, they don't know about these laws. You know, they can't be, you can't increase stigma if they don't know about these laws. We were able to prove that they do indeed, at least in Michigan, know about these laws. Now, Michigan has a policy that people are told about the laws when they receive their positive diagnosis. They also have a policy that their Ryan White case managers tell clients about the law. 42% of our sample, of those who are tested in Michigan, said, yes, I heard about the law when I was diagnosed, which probably shows you the attention span of somebody who's just been diagnosed, right? Because it looked like all of them should have been told about it. So Michigan may be a little bit different. We just finished collecting data in New Jersey, so I'll be really interested. They don't have this policy. I will be interested to see how many people who have HIV in New Jersey know about the law. But still, we're talking, this is part of the cultural context of HIV in Michigan. They know about this law. Okay, then compliance. Now, when we did the study, we defined compliance very, very strictly. So what it was is a person was in compliance if they didn't have any uninformed partners in the previous year. We had to go in the negative, okay? Because, of course, once you break a law, you've broken it forever, right? I mean, or you've broken it, you're not in compliance anymore. But what that operationalized at is they need to have personally disclosed prior to the first time they engaged in a behavior covered in the law. And actually, what we did, this is the one thing that wasn't strict, is we didn't look at mutual masturbation or some of the other things in the law that did not pose a risk. The reason we did that was because I didn't want to reinforce this idea that HIV is transmitted if you just look at somebody. That was one of the reasons. The other reason is that reliability of data on mutual masturbation, for example, it's notoriously unreliable. So I decided, sort of made the executive decision, we weren't going to go there. So we just looked at anal, vaginal, and oral sex. Not only that, but the likelihood that you're going to get a prosecutor who's going to prosecute somebody for mutual masturbation without disclosure, hopefully, is very slim. It hasn't happened yet. So we looked at no uninformed sex partners. And again, had to be before the first time. So check it out. 71% of the sample were in compliance. So a lot of people, I mean, there were thoughts that from sort of the legal side of things, oh, these people have HIV, they're out there, and they're infecting everybody. Actually, that wasn't the case. 71% were in compliance. 100% of those that weren't having sex or hadn't had sex in the last 12 months were in compliance, right? Because you can't have any uninformed partners. 61% of those who were sexually active were also in compliance. Okay, that's 61%, and that included oral sex, whether giving or receiving. Okay, so we saw high compliance.
Is that 71% of the 74% who knew about the law, or did you ask that of everyone?
We asked that of everyone. And yeah, that's a good question. Yep. We also did some sub-analyses among people who knew about the law. Wait a minute, I misspoke. I'm sorry. This was actually a big argument we had, was do we include people who don't know about the law? Because, of course, ignorance of the law is no excuse. We settled on these were people who were aware. Now I just misspoke again. They can't be the sample size. These were everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So 71% of the 74% are new.
No, actually, this is 71% of the 384, minus people who either had inconsistent, minus 17 people, inconsistent data or missing data. So the sample.
Only 76 knew about the law, but 71% of the entire sample.
Right.
Compliant.
Because ignorance of the law is no excuse. That's what.
But your compliance rate is almost 100% of those who knew about the law.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So there you have it. You'll see why probably in a little bit. So then the question was, is the law effective? This is the big question, right? What we did to look at this is we compared people who were aware of the law with people who were unaware of the law. The hypothesis was those who were aware of the law would be more likely to have no uninformed partners than those who are unaware of the law. We saw no effect of the law either with compliance or with abstinence. That could be another effect of the law, right, is that people would just not have sex. So neither were significant. Since then, or actually about 3 years ago, 2 years ago, there was another study that sort of obliquely, indirectly looked at this issue. They also found no effect of the law. So one of the things we can say right off the bat is we're not getting a lot out of this law, right? There's no effect of this law. Here's the however. Participants who are aware of the law disclosed to a greater proportion before the first time they had sex. It looks like there may be a timing factor here. The law says you need to disclose before you have sex, right? In human relationships, what we know with people who have HIV is what we know are most people will disclose shortly after the first time. Often they'll protect their partner or practice low-risk behaviors, right? But it's sort of mutual risk. You don't want to disclose until you're at least involved enough so the other person's at risk. So now you've both, sexually interacted. There's some investment on both sides, then you disclose. The law doesn't allow these relationships to develop naturally. Instead, it says, before they even, agree, you need to disclose. So people who are aware of the law did disclose before. So there may be an issue of timing here. Mm-hmm.
Do you have information about the type of the partner, whether it was a steady?
We do indeed. It's not here because of limited time. We have partner by partner information that tells us. Obviously, it was people who we asked, was this the only time you've had sex with this person or the only time you were going to, like, one-night stands? Of course, disclosure, you would have less often with those. The more partners they had, the less disclosure, that kind of stuff. So nothing really looked particularly surprising. Here's another thing that was sort of interesting. Among those who are sexually active and law aware, this is where we start limiting this sample, 69% reported the law was very important or important in their decision to disclose. We were thinking, people were saying, oh, you know, disclosure is so, you know, it is such an HIV positive. Status disclosure to a prospective sex partner is so complex. Think of all the issues that are going around. People say, nah, the law, they're not thinking about the law, right? So I was really surprised. At least as surprised as I was by how many people knew about the law was the fact that they said, this is very important in my decision. And what's interesting is that came out, self-reported importance and compliance do have a significant relationship. That suggests that there may be some effect, at least with this group, of the law. Okay, so that's effectiveness.
I think you said that part of the Ryan White in the state says that the case managers have to disclose. And I wonder if, because that's consistently reinforced by their case managers, if that plays into why 69%.
Well, that would suggest, I bet the case managers would sort of love to hear that. That would suggest their clients are actually listening to them. And I think that sometimes that's not their experience. It could be, and we actually, you know what, I can go back and actually I can run a test to see if those who reported hearing it from their case manager were more likely. Yeah, I can actually look at that. If you want to email me, I can tell you. My gut sense, just being in the data for a long time, is that we're not going to see significance with that. But boy, wouldn't it be interesting? So.
Is there any post-enforcement? So I know in Illinois, a consumer who just moved back to Connecticut said a sheriff would check in on him every 6 months on his sexual activities. So, yeah.
Okay, it's an interesting question, and I just realized that I'm going to have to kind of whip through some of this. I'm sorry, I love this topic, and I haven't managed time. The question, though, this is an important issue, is that what about enforcement? Is somebody checking in on people who have HIV regularly, et cetera, et cetera? Depends on what state they came from. I'm running a study right now that includes Tennessee. In Tennessee, if you are arrested and convicted under their HIV law, you become a registered sex offender. In that case, you are going to have your behavior monitored. And actually, in Tennessee, they've got 2 kinds of registered sex offenders, those they call violent and those they call nonviolent. Guess where HIV people who've been brought up on these laws, they're violent sex offenders. Yep. So, okay, then, is the law harmful? I looked at comfort with disclosure, the idea being that these laws provide a disincentive to disclose. It was not significant. So people who are aware of the law were not less comfortable disclosing than people who were not aware of the law. I also looked at perceived hostility, did a scale with perceived hostility. That was not significant. So people who are aware of the law didn't perceive the public as more hostile towards people who have HIV. The last one was this internalized stigma, and there was an association. HIV-related stigma was inversely associated, though, with awareness of the law. So that's an inverse association. This one was really puzzling until we thought it through. What this means is that people who were not aware of the law scored higher on this internalized stigma scale than people who were. Of course, the hypothesis is if you're aware of a law that criminalizes people who have HIV, you're gonna be, have more stigma. When we thought about this and did some other analyses, though, it ends up that people who weren't aware of the law were less likely to be connected with social networks of people who have HIV, right? So because they're not connected, they're not getting information on the law, because they're not connected, they're likely to experience more stigma. They haven't had the chance to hear other people's strategies or to be part of the community for stigma reduction. Okay, here's the other big surprise. This is among, again, HIV positive sample, okay? This is support for criminalization. this isn't surprising. 88% supported criminalization of unprotected sex without disclosure. Okay, we weren't really surprised by that. But look at this, oral sex with an uninformed partner. 64% supported criminalization. And condom-protected sex, half. This is not at all what we thought we were going to see. We saw really significant support for these laws among our HIV-positive sample. But look at these associations. These were the demographic associations with support of this law. Women, people who were not white, people who had less education and less income. These were the folks who were supporting these laws. Okay, so summary, were they aware in Michigan? They sure were. Was the law effective? No, there was no independent effect. There were some trends, but no independent effect. The question is, a big theory of compliance in the law is people comply with things that they agree with, right? So if you hold a value, you are likely to agree with the law that holds the same value. So the question is, would they have been inclined to disclose anyway, right? Then harmful, we didn't see any independent effect of the law. And then stance, surprising support for criminalization. So conclusions. I actually come from the Medical College of Wisconsin, so the teaching I do is for medical students, et cetera. So this issue of first do no harm. Based on what we found in this study, we can't say that there's any direct harm. But what we can say is that there's certainly the possibility of harm, right? Certainly. And always err to the conservative. At least, think of the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm. So don't forward legislation that may be harmful, especially if you look at it from a utilitarian perspective, especially if it's not effective. So what you're doing is you're taking a law that isn't effective and you're risking this harm, right? Also, research consistently demonstrates that persons who know they're infected take steps to protect others. Right? If you've got laws that may provide a disincentive to testing, for example, then first do no harm, right? Okay, then note the characteristics of persons who support criminalization. Back to the issue of women supported it, people who are minorities supported it, people with lower income, lower education. What I personally think is happening is that these are people who are likely not to have expected they were at risk or not to feel empowered to prevent infection. So what they're doing is they're looking to the law to protect them, right? When you feel like you're vulnerable, right? You feel a vulnerability, you feel like you can't control it, you look to the criminal law. There should be a law against that, right? You've heard the phrase, right? There should be a law. So these are clearly individuals who are not feeling empowered to protect themselves, whether it's because they're in relationships, for example, where it would be dangerous for them to try to protect themselves, introduce condoms, or because they didn't even see HIV as on their radar. Okay, these are people who we're not meeting their needs. Either we're not meeting them because we didn't sensitize them to their risk, or we're not meeting their needs because they can't take care of themselves. And in that way, it is almost criminal to have somebody put them at risk when, for instance, it would be dangerous for them to protect themselves. Okay, then the last conclusion is note the disconnect between efforts to address HIV in law and efforts in public health. It's a huge, huge disconnect. We haven't looked at this at all. Nobody's gone to Black's Law and said, how does the law think about exposure? How's that different from what we think in public health? Also, you'll notice that a lot of these laws, they undermine our basic public health messages. You can protect yourself. HIV isn't transmitted casually. So there you have it. That's the study.